by comparative standards, it was a period of relatively decent policies, relatively. And it was mainly still a reflection of the activism of the 30s and 40s. By then already there was a major attack on labor going on, which has severely undermined it. Unfortunately, the labor union leadership contributed to this in many respects, but labor has always been at the forefront of progressive social change. This was the residue of the New Deal. The New Deal kind of reflected, labor, to a large extent, labor militancy, which did bring in, pretty progressive policies. I mean, not perfect. I think a lot can be a lot better than that. And plenty of the policies in the 1950s were pretty destructive and awful. But a lot of the kind of regression, and it's serious, is a reflection of the virtual destruction of the labor organizations. Look, this has been a business-run society to an unusual extent by comparative standards for a long time. And there's a very class-conscious business class, which is always fighting a bitter class war. And right away after the Second World War, they organized massive campaigns to drive back the progressive legislation of the 1930s and have been slowly succeeding. Well, a lot of things have changed. First, it's a very atomized society. If you count the number of activists in Boston, there's a fairly large number, but they're separated from one another. There are things going on in downtown Boston which are quite interesting, which I never heard of until I happened to go down there, was invited to give a talk. And the atomization of the society has affected activism. So people are working on usually specific issue-oriented matters and not collaborating and cooperating with others. One thing the labor movement did was bring people together, and that's not so easy, especially when there's tremendous pressures to separate and isolate people. That's what the whole consumerist mania is about, which has huge pressures and money behind it. They're trying to drive people to individual consumption and not cooperation. Say mass transportation, which I mentioned before, is a case in point. The market does not permit mass transportation as an option. Markets, by their nature, restrict choices. They restrict choices to individual self-gratification. Like if I want to go home tonight, a market offers me a choice between a Ford and a Toyota, but it doesn't offer me a choice between a car and a subway. That requires collective action, collective, popular, democratic action, which is markets are inherently opposed to. So we don't have really a market society, but to the extent that there is, it has the effect of undermining constructive activism. There's plenty of other problems too, but certainly those. Labor's been a big factor. It's a huge, organized mass of working people. Remember, the labor movement had virtually been destroyed in the 1920s. It was almost gone. But in the 30s, it revitalized the formation of the CIO, sit-down strikes, industrial organizing, a militant labor movement. That had a huge effect. Working people, there's nothing else like it. There's plenty of activism, but it doesn't have that base. So that's one big part, but by no means all. Like, let me say, take the women's movement, which has probably changed the society more than almost anything else you can think of in the last couple of generations. It was obviously not labor-based. In fact, labor had dubious attitudes towards it.